Let's get the thoughts now of the Conservative MP for Stoke-on-Trent North, Jonathan Gullis. Jonathan, what's your reaction then to where we are at today with all this Rwanda plan? The government is still pursuing it, but no flights will surely leave for Rwanda this side of an election.
Well, look, I share the disappointment, as I'm sure with many GBNews viewers, about the fact that the Supreme Court has ruled against the Rwanda policy. However, we have to respect the Supreme Court in its judgment, even if we don't like it. But I don't think the Plan B that's been presented by the government, this idea of upgrading our Memorandum of Understanding into a treaty, is simply good enough. It doesn't go far enough. The Supreme Court themselves laid out all the different types of international treaties and conventions that we're signed up to that are acting as a blocker for us to be able to get these fights off the ground. And I was very disappointed when I asked the Home Secretary in the chamber just a few minutes ago about the fact whether he'd be willing to not just look at changing the domestic legal framework, which the Prime Minister's spokesperson said they're willing to do, but whether they would be willing to disapply international laws and conventions like the ECHR, like the Refugee Convention, and to get the answer nope from the Home Secretary was simply not good enough.
It's fascinating you mentioned there that this goes beyond the ECHR, as of course the Supreme Court mentioned in their ruling. How likely is it for the government to look at every single international treaty the United Kingdom has, every single obligation? There are potentially dozens of these agreements. To disapply parts of them all would seem perhaps a tad ambitious.
Well, look, if you introduced a notwithstanding bill, something that Bill Cash has been advocating for an awful long period of time, something that myself and Danny Kruger put forward actually as an amendment to the illegal migration bill before it became an act of law, the government obviously didn't want to agree to it then. We think that that could be introduced and something we could get through the House quite speedily. We've seen the government get legislation through in a couple of days when it's wanted to. So this is an idea that I think that should certainly be on the table and explored. And look, I think we've got the judgment from the Supreme Court that does, as you say, Tom, outline the different conventions and treaties which are obstacles to us being able to take back control of our borders. And essentially, if we don't do that, if we don't go as far as we need to go to deliver on this important pledge from the Prime Minister, the Conservative Party will reap what it sows at the ballot box of the next general election. In my Stoke-on-Trent North, Kidsgrove and Tork constituency, 73% voted to leave the European Union. I proudly campaigned for that, to take back control of our laws and our borders, and at the moment it doesn't feel like that.
Jonathan Gullis, a notwithstanding bill, if it achieved support of the government, could pass the Commons. But isn't the problem here that whenever the government has tried to do something ambitious on the borders, you only hold a third of the seats in the House of Lords, and of course the courts often interfere too? Wouldn't the problem with a notwithstanding bill be that the Lords wouldn't pass it?
Well, look, you could obviously put something onto it, which means that we could basically bypass, essentially, the House of Lords. But now we've obviously got our Foreign Secretary in the House of Lords, someone who I'm sure will proudly advocate for the government's agenda in there, as well as obviously looking to keep our relations around the world. And I hope that he would be able to provide the masterstroke that is needed to get it through the laws quickly, using all those years of experience that he's rightly pointed out that he has, both as a Prime Minister, as a leader of the Conservative Party, and now soon to be a peer of the House of Lords.
Something that you suggested should happen, Jonathan, is physically pushing the small boats back into French waters in the Channel.
Well, yes, look, under the Nationality and Borders Act, the former Home Secretary, Priti Patel, enabled the ability to push back, something the Australians use very successfully, which is nudging boats back into French territorial waters and actually demanding the French pick those people up and take them back to French shores. It is completely unacceptable that it's constantly British vessels going deep into French territorial waters to help people who are illegally trying to enter our country, who have chosen to put themselves in a very dangerous vessel, when actually the French are just standing by watching the boat and not doing anything about it themselves. It makes a mockery of the near £700 million that we've invested into our relationship with the French to date. And even though small boats crossings in terms of people are down by a third, and in terms of vessels down by 50%, we're still at nearly 30,000 people for this year alone. It's simply not good enough. The people have had enough, especially in places like Stoke, where they've been taken advantage of for far too long, having their housing supply taken up, school places stretched, and obviously the NHS put under further strain.
Well, of course, the government would say that 22,000 crossings have been prevented by UK-France cooperation in the last year. But I think, Jonathan Gullis, you do speak for a huge proportion of the electorate when you say that that's not good enough. We thank you for your time here on GB News this afternoon.
I'm not sure there'd be the capability to actually physically push back all the boats?
I know the government often says that there's not international water between the UK and France, which is the difference between the Australia parallel, where there was international water. But of course, there are those who argue that it is entirely possible too.